Capítulo 1. The Candle That Burned Backwards. What if I told you I once saw time itself burning in reverse? It happened the night I found the candle. The chapel had been abandoned for decades, its walls bleeding with damp and silence. The air was thick, swollen with the smell of mildew and forgotten prayers. I stepped inside with nothing more than a flashlight, but it flickered like it too feared what lingered here. The pews were broken, the crucifix tilted, Christ's wooden face split by rot. And yet, amid the ruins, there it was, a candle, perfect, untouched by dust, untouched by time. Its wax was pure white, almost glowing in the dark, and though no one had lit it, the wick burned, but it burned wrong. The flame wasn't devouring from the top down. No, the wax itself seemed to climb, reforming as though the candle was remaking itself. It was burning backwards, devouring time instead of matter. I should have run. But something about it demanded attention. A strange warmth curled inside my chest, as if the flame recognized me, calling me by name without a sound. I reached out, trembling, and when my fingers hovered inches above the flame, I felt it. Cold, not hot. A cold so deep it bit into my bones. Then the air changed. The chapel groaned as though it remembered being alive. From the shadows, the scent of incense rose, but twisted, sweet at first, then metallic, until it stung my throat like blood. I heard something too, a whisper carried inside the flame. It wasn't in English. It wasn't even in Latin. It was older, heavier, like stone grinding against stone. The candle's wax reversed faster now, climbing, rebuilding itself. And with every inch, shadows stretched longer across the walls. One of them didn't move with the others. One of them turned its head. I froze. It was the shape of a man kneeling, as though in prayer, though no one was there. His hands pressed together, trembling, his mouth opening and closing in silent confession. But the candle gave him a voice, a low moan, broken, desperate, spilled out of the darkness. Not from his throat, but from the flame itself. It echoed through the chapel, vibrating through the pews, rattling the cracked, stained glass. I backed away, but the shadow followed. With every flicker of the candle, it grew closer, kneeling behind me now, breathing against my neck. I didn't dare turn. Then, in a voice so clear it split the silence in half, the flame whispered 3 words. "Do you remember?" The chapel doors slammed shut. The light from my flashlight died, and for the first time in my life, I felt as though time itself was moving backwards, dragging me with it. The candle kept burning, and I couldn't look away. Capítulo 2. The First Confession. Have you ever heard a confession that wasn't meant for human ears? Because that's exactly what happened to me the first night the candle began to burn backwards. The chapel was silent, dust hanging like cobwebs of time itself when the wax melted in reverse, climbing instead of dripping. The smoke curled into shapes, and from within it, a whisper broke through. It wasn't a whisper meant for me. It was a voice, old and tired, worn down by guilt, a priest's voice. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." My blood turned cold. I knew those words, the formula of confession. But there was no priest left alive here. The last one had died decades ago, his body found slumped against the confessional door. And yet, through that flame, he spoke. I followed the sound, even though my bones screamed for me to run. The wooden booth, broken and splintered by years of rot, seemed to breathe as I approached. Inside, shadows bent unnaturally, and the scent of burning wax was thicker, heavier, mixed with something metallic, blood. Then his voice deepened. I took their voices, every sinner who confessed to me. I swallowed their words, their sins, and locked them inside myself. I thought silence was redemption, but silence is damnation. I wanted to cover my ears. I wanted to shut out the words clawing at me, but they wrapped around my mind like chains. The candle burned faster now, climbing its own body, erasing wax as if erasing time. And then the face appeared, not flesh, not bone, just a mask of smoke pressing against the wooden screen of the confessional. Hollow eyes glowed faintly like embers. "Do you know what happens?" it asked. "When a priest dies with the sins of others still trapped in his lungs?" The booth shook. Splinters rained down. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, but the voice followed, dripping like wax into my skull. "They don't stay with God. They stay here." The flame hissed. and for a brief moment I heard them, the voices of hundreds, whispers overlapping, gasping, sobbing, confessions never absolved, sins never forgiven. They filled the chapel, crawling along the walls, making the crucifix above the altar tilt as if it, too, was listening. The candle's smoke slithered up my arm like a serpent, wrapping tighter, whispering secrets that weren't mine. I felt my own heart beat out of rhythm, as though time itself was trying to reverse inside me. And then the priest gave his final words, words that cracked like thunder in the silence. Someone must carry them now. The flame snapped, the smoke vanished, and the chapel was quiet again. But the weight in my chest remained. The sins weren't his anymore. They were mine. Capítulo 3. The Scent of Wax and Blood. Do you know what fear smells like? It isn't sweat, it isn't smoke. It's blood, hidden beneath something sweet, like wax. That was the scent that filled the chapel after the candle's second night. I had sworn never to return. Yet something inside me, something the flame had touched, pulled me back. When I stepped across the cracked threshold, the air was heavier, as if the building itself had been waiting for me. The candle stood in the same place on the altar, though its body looked fuller, taller, as if time had rebuilt what should have melted away. The flame flickered hungrily, and with every breath I took, the stench grew thicker, warm wax laced with iron. It was the smell of a wound that would not heal. I followed the scent deeper into the chapel. The pews groaned under invisible weight, as though unseen bodies sat watching me. My footsteps echoed too loudly, like I was not walking alone. And then, just beyond the candlelight, I noticed it. A door. A wooden door I hadn't seen before. Its edges were sealed shut with hardened wax, thick as veins. The smell was strongest here, almost suffocating. I pressed my hand against it. The wood pulsed. It wasn't just a door, it was breathing. The candle's flame hissed. Wax dripped backwards across the floor, crawling toward the sealed entrance as if guiding me. My stomach twisted. I should have left. I should have burned that cursed thing to ash. But my hand moved on its own, scraping at the wax until the door gave way with a sound like tearing flesh. Inside was a small chamber, dark and airless. My flashlight flickered to life, and that's when I saw it. Stains. Brown-black patches smeared across the walls. The scent of blood was unbearable now. Chains dangled from the ceiling, clinking softly though no wind touched them. And at the very center of the room, resting on a stone slab, was another candle. It was identical to the first, but this one was not burning. It was bleeding. Thick red wax oozed from its base, pooling on the floor. Except it wasn't wax. My shoes stuck to the ground as I stepped closer, and the realization froze me in place. It was blood, fresh, warm, and still flowing, though no body lay nearby to feed it. And then I heard it, a heartbeat. Not mine. The candles, the flame on the altar behind me roared, its light spilling into the chamber. The shadows on the wall shifted, gathering together, forming outlines of kneeling figures. Their mouths opened wide, but no sound came, only the candle's heartbeat, louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. I stumbled back, choking on the metallic stench, and as I did, the unlit candle trembled. A crack ran down its side, and from it, something inside pressed outward, desperate to escape. The flame outside flared brighter, and the chamber whispered in unison, a chorus of voices I will never forget. "Open it, set us free." The bleeding candle pulsed, and I realized it wasn't a candle at all. Capítulo 4. The Nun Without a Face. Have you ever prayed to something that had no face? Because that's who came to me on the third night. I thought I could ignore the bleeding candle, the prison of wax and blood I had discovered. I thought if I locked the chamber and left, the whispers would die inside the stone walls. But when night fell, the candle burned on its own, summoning me back like a guilty child to confession. This time, the air was colder. The flame no longer danced, it bowed, bending low as though in reverence. And from the smoke rising above it, a shape began to form. At first it was only a veil, black, heavy, gliding upward as though carried by invisible hands. Then came the habit, long and ragged, stitched by shadows themselves. Finally, the outline of a woman, a nun. She knelt in the candlelight, hands clasped, head bowed. But where her face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no mouth, no skin, only a pale oval of emptiness. And yet she spoke. Her voice was not born of lips. It crawled straight into my skull, heavy and wet, like whispers dragged from a throat that no longer existed. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, the Lord's Prayer. But twisted. The words bled backward, each syllable unraveling into something unholy. I tried to step back, but my feet would not move. The candle's flame pinned me in place, forcing me to listen as the prayer dissolved into sobs. Her faceless head tilted toward me, and though she had no eyes, I knew she was looking at me. No, through me. I prayed, she whispered, until my tongue was nothing but ash. I confessed until my lips wore away, and still, he did not listen. So I gave him my face, and he gave me silence. The chapel groaned. The crucifix above the altar bent, the wood crying out as though in pain. The scent of burning wax and old blood filled my lungs again, and the nun, no, the thing that wore her shape, began to crawl forward. Her knees cracked against the stone, leaving trails of black soot behind. Closer, closer. Her hands reached for me, fingers too long, nails clicking like rosary beads. I shut my eyes, praying, whispering every word I could remember. But my prayers twisted in my mouth, reversing themselves before they reached the air. When I opened my eyes, her faceless head was inches from mine, and then she breathed. Cold air spilled from where her mouth should have been, heavy with the scent of incense and rot. Her whisper coiled inside my ear, sealing itself into my brain. You will pray backward until your face is gone too. The candle flickered violently, the shadows shrieked, and in an instant, she was gone. But when I touched my cheek afterward, I felt it. The skin was colder, numb, as if my face had already begun to fade. Capítulo 5, time running in reverse. Have you ever watched time break apart, like glass shattering, then mending itself backward? I did, the night the candle turned against the clock. I hadn't slept for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the faceless nun breathing against me, peeling away my features in silence. But the candle wouldn't allow me rest. Its flame burned in my mind, a reverse heartbeat, pulling me back to the chapel. This time the air was different. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something had changed. The chapel wasn't decaying anymore. The mold on the walls had retreated. The pews looked less broken, the crucifix straighter. It was as if the candle was not just burning backward. It was undoing time. The wax climbed in sharp bursts, each crackle pulling the building out of ruin. And then I saw it. A drop of blood I'd left on the floor 2 nights ago. Now it quivered, then slid upward, crawling back into the cut on my hand. The wound sealed itself with a sting that made my teeth clench. My body, my skin, even my breath seemed caught in this reversal. And then the sound began, crying, but not forward. The sobs bent themselves into laughter, children's giggles twisting into screams, then reversing again into silence. It was unbearable, like listening to the world choke on its own throat. The shadows moved differently now. One by one, they replayed themselves, a crucifix falling back into place, a candle melting, then growing tall again, a dead rat swelling with life, standing, scurrying backward into the cracks of stone. But the worst was the people. They appeared in flashes. A woman kneeling in prayer, but her lips moved in reverse, prayers sucked back into her chest. A man in priestly robes, collapsing into life, wounds closing as blood crawled back into his skin. And then children, smiling, screaming, then alive again, dragged backward into pews that no longer existed. I stumbled toward the altar, clutching my head, my stomach lurching as if my own body wanted to vomit itself into the past. And then the candle's flame bent, stretching upward like a finger pointing. It pointed at me. Suddenly, my heart slammed against my ribs, beat after beat, but reversed. I gasped. Breath left my lungs before I could inhale. My vision blurred, and in the candlelight I saw myself, standing in the same chapel, days younger, eyes wide with fear. I was watching myself enter, watching myself trapped in a loop of time the flame had devoured. Then the whispers began again, low and endless. The faceless nun's voice, the priest's confession, the chorus of the damned. They weren't separate anymore. They overlapped, melted together into one unbearable truth. You cannot escape the past when the past is devouring you. The flame snapped and everything stopped. Time froze, the shadows held their breath. The chapel was still, but in the silence I heard it, faint, steady, undeniable. My own heart, beating backward. Capítulo 6. The candle marks the guilty. Have you ever felt a light strip you bare, peeling away every secret you thought was buried? That's what the candle did on the sixth night. I entered the chapel trembling, my face still numb where the faceless nun had breathed on me. The air was suffocating, thick with incense and old blood, but I couldn't stop myself. The candle was waiting, and it burned higher now, brighter, as though feeding on something unseen. When I crossed the threshold, the flame shifted. It leaned toward me, as if recognizing prey. And then, without warning, it flared outward, spilling a wave of pale light across the chapel. It didn't just illuminate the walls, it revealed. The shadows that had lingered in silence snapped into form. Dozens of figures filled the pews, men, women, children. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths stitched with wax. Each one glowed faintly under the candle's light, and on their chests appeared marks, burning sigils, letters, and words written in fire. At first I didn't understand, but then I read them. Adulterer, blasphemer, murderer, thief. Every soul carried a brand, the flame carving their sins into their skin. Some screamed silently, clawing at the letters as if they could scrape them away. Others knelt, trembling, their hands locked in endless prayer. And then the light turned to me. The flame stretched long, thin, and pointed, striking me like a divine finger. I froze as my chest grew hot. Pain seared into my skin, as though something was carving from the inside out. I ripped open my shirt and saw it, letters burning into flesh. But it wasn't a word. It was a sentence. He remembers. The words pulsed like open wounds, glowing with every heartbeat. The chapel roared alive with whispers. Every figure turned its hollow gaze on me, mouths breaking open, wax tearing, releasing shrieks that weren't screams but laughter. He remembers, they repeated over and over, their voices overlapping until it became thunder. My knees buckled. I pressed my hands against the burning letters on my chest, desperate to erase them. But the more I tried, the deeper they glowed. The light wasn't just marking me, it was declaring me guilty, not of their sins, but of mine. And that's when the candle spoke, not in words, not in whispers, but through pure thought, drilling straight into my skull. Confess or be consumed. The pews rattled. Chains swung from the ceiling. The bleeding candle in the chamber throbbed with fresh blood. Every soul leaned forward, waiting for my confession. But here's the truth I can't admit out loud, not even now. I don't remember what I'm supposed to confess. And that's the worst kind of guilt. The kind that knows it's guilty, even when the memory is gone. The candle's flame quivered, almost amused, and the shadows shrank back into silence. But the mark on my chest stayed, searing like an open wound. It was no longer a chapel. It was a courtroom, and I had already been sentenced. Capítulo 7, The Burning Bible. Have you ever seen holy words burn and still breathe? I have, and they weren't God's words anymore. The chapel was colder that night, as if the walls themselves had lost their faith. The candle stood taller, more alive, its flame reaching like a hand toward the ceiling, and at its base, something new waited for me. A Bible. It hadn't been there before. The leather was cracked, the edges blackened as though fire had kissed it long ago. I picked it up with trembling fingers, but the moment I touched it, the candle roared to life. The flame stretched, wrapping the book in fire. I screamed, dropping it, but the Bible didn't burn away. No, the fire carved into it. Each page glowed, words blistering, shifting, rewriting themselves under the heat. Where once were prayers of mercy, there were now commands of terror. Where once was forgiveness, there was judgment. Every verse I read twisted backward into something unholy. Thou shalt love thy neighbor became, thou shalt consume thy neighbor. Blessed are the meek became, damned are the silent. The air thickened with smoke, but not normal smoke. It slithered, alive, forming shapes of saints and martyrs. Their mouths gaped open, screaming, though no sound came. The crucifix above the altar groaned, wood cracking, as if Christ himself was turning away from what the book had become. Then a voice rose from the burning pages, not whispered, not human, thunderous, layered like countless priests speaking at once. These are the verses you never heard, it said. The verses hidden, because they were not for salvation, but for punishment. The book opened wide on its own. Pages turned violently, stopping on a section I had never seen in any scripture. Letters bled across the paper, dripping like ink made from blood. And there, written in fire, was my name. My knees gave way. I crawled backward, choking on the smoke, but the Bible followed, its pages flipping, every verse louder than the last. I covered my ears, but the words still sank in, gnawing into my skull like teeth. He remembers. He remembers. He remembers. The flame from the candle surged higher, connecting with the book until they were one. Fire and scripture, scripture and curse. And then, the Bible shut itself with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The silence afterward was worse than the voices. When I dared to look, the Bible rested on the altar again, untouched by flame, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Because when I opened it again, just to prove my sanity, the words were normal, unburned, as if no change had ever taken place. All except one page. The page with my name, still written in blood. Episode 8. The Ashes That Spoke. They say ashes are silent, final, the last whisper of something that once had life. But in Father Elias's study, the ashes of the candle did not rest. They writhed, shifting in impossible spirals, forming shapes that dissolved before his blinking eyes. When the last curl of smoke vanished, the pile of gray dust began to spread, as if an invisible hand were dragging it across the desk. He leaned closer, heart hammering, and watched the grains of ash align into words. You cannot stop what has already begun. The priest staggered back. His crucifix slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. His instinct told him to sweep the message away, to scatter the blasphemy. But another part of him, a darker, more curious part, was compelled to read. The words shifted again. This time they formed a sentence that froze him to the marrow. We remember your sins, Elias. His breath caught, his past. The mistakes he thought buried under robes and ritual, now written in the dust of a candle that should never have burned. The candle itself, once tall and elegant, now resembled a grotesque relic. Its wax was gone, consumed in reverse, leaving a brittle husk of blackened wick. Yet he swore he saw faint light still pulsing deep within the ash, like an ember refusing to die. And then the whisper began. Not from the walls, not from the shadows. The voice came directly from the ashes. It rasped, broken and layered, as if 100 throats spoke at once through soot. Confess, Father, before we confess for you. The air thickened with a choking smell, like flesh scorched on an altar. Elias covered his mouth, but the stench crawled into his lungs regardless, a burning heaviness that forced his knees to the ground. His eyes watered. Through the blur, he saw the ashes rise into the air, spiraling into the faint outline of a human face. Its hollow sockets stared into him, not at him, but into him, searching for the wounds of his soul. The face leaned closer, and the whispers turned into a scream that rattled the shelves of holy books. Every prayer you uttered was a lie. The study fell into darkness. The candle was no more. Yet on the desk, scrawled in soot across the wood, was a final command. Light it again. Episode 9. The Flame That Branded Flesh. Father Elias awoke to the taste of ash on his tongue. His room was cold, darker than it should have been, as though the night itself had thickened around him. He sat up, clutching his chest, and that was when he felt it. Heat, sharp and searing, crawling across his skin as if something were writing on him from the inside. He tore open his cassock. There, etched into his flesh, was a pattern of burning lines. Not cuts, not bruises, letters. They shimmered as though inked in fire. Light it again. His trembling fingers brushed the scorched words, and the pain intensified. The mark seared him deeper, branding him like an animal claimed by an unseen master. He cried out, but the walls of the rectory swallowed the sound whole. Desperation drove him back to the study where the ashes of the candle still lay in their mocking spiral. Yet now, impossibly, the remains had reformed. From gray dust rose a stub of wax, half melted, twisted and wrong, as though it remembered what it once was. Elias staggered forward, sweat dripping into his eyes. He reached for the crucifix on the desk, but the cross was blistering hot, forcing him to drop it. The flame that wasn't there had already taken possession of the room. And then it began. A glow, faint at first, pulsed inside the ruined candle. The backward flame returned, but it didn't rise. No, it sank into the wick, descending into darkness instead of reaching upward. The light pulled at him, dragging his gaze down, down. as though the candle opened a hole into the pit of creation itself. He tried to turn away, but his branded chest burned hotter, as though resisting his defiance. His body betrayed him, forcing him closer to the flame. The air thickened, humming with a chant he didn't recognize, words in a language that vibrated in his bones but never touched his ears. Suddenly, the stub of wax spat sparks, and one landed on his wrist. He screamed as the tiny ember burrowed into his skin, carving yet another word. Yours. Blood mixed with ash on the floorboards. He fell to his knees, clutching his wrist, choking on the smoke that seemed to come from nowhere. The candle's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, low and relentless. Burn with us, or burn alone. And with every pulse of the backward flame, the brand on his chest deepened, the scent of his own flesh rising like incense. Episode 10, The Parish That Smelled of Smoke. The first to notice was Maria, the sacristan. She arrived before dawn to polish the chalices, humming softly to herself when the air changed. It was sharp, metallic, laced with the unmistakable sting of burning. She froze. The church was cold stone, damp with centuries of silence. There was no reason it should smell like fire. Then she saw it. On the sleeve of her blouse, a small black mark had appeared overnight. At first she thought it was soot, some smudge from the oil lamps. But when she tried to rub it away, pain lanced through her arm. The mark wasn't on her clothing. It was on her skin, burnt into her flesh in the shape of a crooked letter. By noon, 3 more parishioners had come forward. Each bore their own mark. An old man with scarred palms, a child with a blister curling across her shoulder, and a mother whose throat bore the faint outline of a word no one dared to pronounce aloud. They gathered in the nave, frightened, whispering that something had cursed the church. Father Elias listened, his collar damp with sweat, his branded chest throbbing beneath his cassock. Every mark they showed mirrored the torment carved into him. The candle's reach was no longer confined to his study. It was spreading like plague, choosing its victims at random. One of the men stepped forward, voice shaking. Father, we all smelled smoke last night. We thought it was nothing. But when we awoke, he raised his hands, scar tissue raw and red. What does it mean? Elias wanted to tell them the truth, that the backward flame had devoured the boundaries of sin and flesh alike, that it was branding them as it had branded him, but the words withered on his tongue. If he confessed, they would see his weakness, they would see his guilt. Instead, he reached for the holy water, muttering prayers that sounded thin in the echoing church. But when the drops touched the burned letters, they hissed, evaporating in small curls of black smoke. The congregation gasped. One child began to cry, and then silence. A low hum rose from beneath the stone floor. The pews trembled, as though the entire church had become a living lung inhaling smoke. The scent thickened, choking, until every eye turned toward the altar. There, without flame, a candle stood. A stub of wax, gray and trembling, though no one had placed it there. Its wick glowed faintly, not with fire, but with an ember burning inward, pulling light into itself. The branded marks on every parishioner flared at once, searing them to screams. Father Elias fell to his knees, clutching his chest, knowing this was no longer his burden alone. The candle had chosen a congregation, and it had just begun to burn them backwards. Episode 11. The Mass That Reversed. Sunday came, though the sun itself seemed reluctant to rise. Clouds smothered the sky, the bells tolled hollow, and the pews filled with faces carved by fear. Each parishioner bore the marks now, letters, symbols, words etched into flesh as though branded by unseen hands. They had stopped whispering among themselves. They only stared at Father Elias, waiting to see if he would save them or betray them. Elias's heart pounded as he stood at the altar. The crucifix loomed above, but the gaze of Christ no longer brought him comfort. Instead, it seemed to judge, silent and unblinking. He raised the chalice, his voice cracked on the opening prayer. But then, everything shifted. The words of the liturgy slipped from his tongue, yet they didn't fall into the air as prayers. They crawled backward, reversing themselves, as though dragged by an invisible force. The congregation heard it too. Gasps rippled through the nave as sacred Latin distorted, syllables twisting into guttural sounds no human mouth should form. The wine within the chalice darkened. not the crimson of Christ's blood, but a black ichor that shimmered like oil. When Elias tilted it, the liquid crawled up the sides of the cup rather than down, and then came the smoke. It bled from the altar cloth, thin tendrils rising without flame. The air thickened, and in that haze the backward candle appeared, stubby, gray, its wick glowing downward. It stood where no one had placed it, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The parishioners cried out, clutching their branded flesh as the marks blazed hot. One woman collapsed, writhing as a single word burned across her back. Offer. Elias dropped the chalice, black liquid splattering across the marble floor, seeping toward the kneeling faithful. His throat tightened, but the candle spoke for him. A chorus of voices poured from its ember. This is no mass of salvation. It is a feast of reclamation. The congregation screamed, but their voices didn't rise. Instead, the sound flowed backward, sucked into the candle's ember, until silence reigned. And in that silence, Elias understood the horror. The mass had inverted. Every prayer he uttered fed not heaven, but something beneath. Every act of devotion had become fuel for the flame that burned in reverse. The church was no longer a house of God. It was a mouth, and the candle was teaching it how to swallow. Episode 12, The Revolt of the Branded. The church reeked of smoke and fear. The backward flame pulsed on the altar, devouring prayers, twisting the mass into something unholy. And in the pews, the faithful broke. Maria was the first to rise. Her blouse clung to her sweat, and the branded mark on her arm blazed like molten iron. "It's him!" she screamed, pointing at Father Elias. Her voice cracked with terror, yet the accusation struck like lightning. Others followed. The old man with scarred palms, the mother with the burning throat, every eye turned toward the priest. Rage and desperation boiled together. "You brought this into our church," one man roared. "You lit the cursed flame." Elias staggered back from the altar, his cassock clinging to his trembling body. The brand on his chest seared hotter, as if the candle delighted in betrayal. "No," he gasped, voice raw. "I tried to contain it, but they were not listening." They surged toward him, their marks flaring in unison, their flesh glowing like coals. The congregation was no longer just a flock. They had become an extension of the flame, united by torment, driven by one thought: sacrifice the guilty. The pews toppled as bodies pressed forward, hands clawed, nails raked across his sleeves. Someone struck him, and he tasted blood. Another tore the crucifix from around his neck and hurled it across the nave. The holy symbol clattered uselessly against the stone. "Offer him!" Maria screamed, her eyes wild. "Give him to the fire!" They dragged Elias toward the altar. His knees scraped against the marble, leaving smears of blood. The backward candle flared, its ember pulsing faster, brighter, hungry. He felt its pull, as though gravity itself had turned inside out, dragging him toward the wick. "Listen to me," he shouted, struggling against their grip. "It's not me, it's the candle. It feeds on us all." But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. The congregation's mouths moved in unison, chanting words they did not understand. Voices stolen by the flame. Their bodies were puppets, and the candle was the hand. They lifted him onto the altar. His branded flesh screamed with heat. The stub of wax trembled, its ember opening like an eye. He felt himself falling, though he had not moved, falling into that inverted fire, into a hunger that had no bottom. The last thing he saw was his parish, kneeling as one, their branded bodies bowed before the flame that burned backward. And then the light consumed him. Episode 13, The Town That Smoldered. When Father Elias vanished into the backward flame, the parish fell silent. The ember dimmed, the smoke thinned, and for a breathless moment, they thought it was over. But the marks on their skin told another story. One by one, the branded letters shifted, crawling beneath their flesh like worms. The words rewrote themselves into something new. Maria lifted her sleeve to see her arm scrawled with fresh ink of fire. The letters spelled, "You are the wick." And then the burning spread, not just in the church, but beyond. That night, the people of San Aurelio awoke to screams. Windows glowed with flickers of light, not from torches or candles, but from skin itself. Parishioners stumbled into the streets, their branded words igniting like molten scripture across their bodies. The air filled with the reek of seared flesh and the low hum of voices chanting prayers backward. The townsfolk who had not entered the church tried to flee, but found the roads cloaked in smoke. Lamps failed. Even the stars above were swallowed by darkness. The whole town was caught inside a dome of ash. And in the heart of it all, the church stood alive. Its walls breathed, its bell tolled without hands, and from its windows spilled the glow of the backward candle, though no flame could be seen. The building itself had become a vessel. Children sobbed as their parents convulsed, marks blazing across their throats. Merchants dropped in the streets, their prayers ripped from their mouths and dragged into the invisible ember at the church's core. Even those untouched by the brand began to cough smoke, their lungs filling with ash as if their very souls were smoldering. Maria, her arms seared with the words, screamed until her voice broke, yet she was not consumed. No, she was transformed. Her eyes burned with the same glow as the ember. She raised her hand, and every branded body bent with her, kneeling toward the church like puppets. From the altar, the voice of the candle thundered through the night. The priest was the first flame, but you are the fire. And so the town of San Aurelio began to burn. Not upward, not outward, but inward. Its people collapsing into themselves, their bodies shrinking into ash, leaving behind only whispers carried on the smoke. The candle did not end with Elias. It had only found a larger wick. Episode 14, The Prophet of Ash. By dawn, San Aurelio was gone. Where houses once stood, there were only black outlines, like shadows burned into stone. Where voices once prayed, only whispers drifted, circling in endless echoes. And in the center of it all stood Maria. Her skin no longer bore a single wound. The branded letters that had seared her flesh were gone. But not forgotten. They lived inside her now, glowing faintly in her veins, racing through her blood like liquid fire. Her eyes shimmered with the ember's light. The townsfolk that remained alive, if they could still be called alive, knelt in silence around her. Their bodies were hollowed, their faces vacant, yet they moved with one will, hers. No, not hers. Its. When Maria spoke, it was not with her own voice. The sound was layered. A chorus stitched together from every soul the candle had devoured. The priest was the beginning, the voices intoned through her lips. The town is the vessel. The world will be the flame. She lifted her hand, and the hollowed parishioners rose in unison. They carried no torches, no weapons. Their very bodies smoldered faintly, their branded flesh smoking as they moved. Wherever they stepped, the earth blackened. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, San Aurelio had become a wound on the landscape, a scar no map would explain. Travelers who passed along the valley path that morning whispered of a stench so thick it clung to their throats, of smoke that drifted though no fire could be seen. They swore they heard voices carried on the wind, chanting backwards, naming sins they had never confessed. And at the edge of the road stood Maria, waiting. Her eyes, two inverted flames, fixed on the world beyond. Behind her, the branded congregation stood like statues, silent but ready. She extended her palm, and in it lay a stub of wax, gray, twisted, eternal. Its wick pulsed downward with that same impossible glow. The candle that burned backwards had chosen its prophet, and through Maria it would march beyond the ashes of San Aurelio. Episode 15. The Last Procession. They left San Aurelio at dusk. A column of the branded moved silently down the valley road, their bodies smoldering faintly, smoke curling from the words burned into their skin. Their eyes glowed like coals, but their mouths never opened. They were pilgrims without hymns, carrying no crosses, no relics, only the weight of an unholy fire. At their head walked Maria, the prophet of Ash. In her hand burned the stub of wax, though no flame touched it. Its ember pulsed inward, swallowing the light of every lantern it passed. Birds fell silent in the trees, and even the river beside the road seemed to choke, its waters darkening as the procession crossed. Villagers from the next town gathered at their windows, watching in terror as the column advanced. Some clutched rosaries, others barred their doors. But none dared step into the path, for each time someone whispered a prayer, the branded would stop, turn, and their branded words would flare with fire. The prayer would die in the throat of the speaker, ripped away as though consumed before heaven could hear it. By midnight, the church bell of that next town tolled by itself. No one had touched the rope. The branded entered its square, and the crowd that had gathered scattered like birds. Yet Maria did not run. She climbed the church steps, her feet leaving black prints across the stone. She turned to face the people, raising the stub of wax. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was the layered roar of 1,000 souls. The priest offered himself. The town followed. "You will not be spared. You will be the fire that lights the world." The branded fell to their knees, bowing as if before an altar. The air grew thick, the stars above dimmed, and then the ember expanded. No longer just a backward flame in a stub of wax. It unfurled across the night sky like an inverted aurora, pulling light down instead of casting it out. The villagers screamed, but their voices went nowhere. Each cry was dragged into the sky, feeding the ember until it pulsed with the weight of their despair. One by one they collapsed, branded mid-breath, their flesh marked by letters too ancient to read. And when the light finally faded, the town was gone. Only Maria remained, standing amid ash, her eyes brighter than ever. She smiled faintly, not her smile, but its. The candle that burned backwards no longer needed a wick. The world itself had begun to burn.
Epilogue: The smoke that remains. They say San Aurelio never existed. Maps show only a blank valley, a stretch of barren earth where nothing grows. Travelers pass quickly, unwilling to linger in the silence that clings to the air there. Yet some swear they've seen shapes in the distance, processions of figures moving without sound, their bodies trailing smoke, their eyes glowing faintly in the dusk. And every so often, in towns far from the valley, strange things occur. A child wakes with letters burned into their skin. A priest opens his Bible only to find the words printed backward. A widow lights a candle in memory of her husband, and the flame bends inward, devouring itself. The church denies it. Of course, they call it rumor, hysteria, pagan superstition. But behind closed doors, bishops whisper of San Aurelio, of the priest who vanished into fire, and of the woman who walks the earth with an ember in her hand. Some say Maria is still out there, her procession growing with every town that falls silent. Others claim she is no longer flesh at all, but smoke, rising where prayers are weakest, seeping through the cracks of faith. And if you listen closely, on nights when the air smells faintly of soot, you might hear it too. A chant, spoken in reverse, a flame that burns without light, a whisper carried on the wind. You are the wick.